Okay, dropping down to ground level vis-a-vis the road building process. And there's one thing I didn't put on the slides that would have been useful, but there's an interdependency between loggers typically and the private individuals, the farmers and the smallholders or large holders, as the case may be, that come into the forested areas. But the process works is that you have established a small holding, such as up here, and typically the people who establish this small holding with an eye towards forest penetration will come out to the very edge of a settled area. So this could be perhaps, for example, a Travessão that's maybe 20 kilometers long, come out to the very end of the Travessão, and then individuals start building what's called a picada out beyond the last area, the farthest reach of the road. And then along the picada, other settlers will enter, and once enough enter the picada, they'll begin exerting political, economic influence on local government or on nearby loggers to bring out road improving equipment, bulldozers as the case may be, and they'll come out and improve the road and keep building it. And so this, as I say, will involve not just the smallholders or the large holders, the farmers, but also loggers who then have access typically to timber on stands that have been claimed by the farming individuals. And the roads can extend in the area of the Trans-Amazon, BR-230, you'll see them out to 100 kilometers in places. So when you look at some of the imagery, and I'll throw some up, I mean, it's quite amazing just how far these roads will go. Excuse me?
Thousands of kilometers.
Yeah. Yeah, when you add it all together, it will be thousands, tens of thousands of kilometers, all the roads put together. So that's how the process works, this collusive interaction between loggers and farmers typically, and ranchers.
Can I just say, so these people, they just claim land and assume that nobody owns it?
Typically it's called terra devoluta. Okay. Yep, and they'll come in and claim it. Yeah, it's getting harder to do that because less of the land is accessible, but yes. So this is a slide from one of the papers we brought out, an expanding road system near Itaituba, which is on the banks of the Tapajós River, so south 300 kilometers or so from Santarém. And what you can see in the very beginning is not much. There are a couple of roads. This is from one of the very early maps that we were able to get from the region. And then as we move across 80 to 87, it's all color-coded, the amounts of the roads that were built in yellow in that period of time, in blue in that period of time, and then out here extensions in purple going way up, all the way to Contentious. It's amazing just how long the roads have expanded right outside of Itaituba. So that would be an example of the sort of encroachment of the forest by typically farmers, but also farmers and loggers. And so once people come in and occupy the land, they start farming on either side of it. Now this is an interesting case because right over here is something very important, the Amazon National Park. And some of the roads, if you overlay the park boundaries, you'll see some of the penetrations have gone into Amazon National Park. So it's not always the case that it's terra devoluta. Sometimes it'll be a protected area, sometimes it'll be an indigenous reserve. So there can be real problems. So, okay, it's a fairly abrupt shift in topic, fragmentation, but
we just had a whole lecture on it, so that's fine.
Okay, but let me motivate conversation here, which is that, well, you know, in the beginning when people talked about deforestation, most of the conversation was about aggregate numbers. So, for example, you know, Brazil has lost 700,000 square kilometers of forest, or Indonesia has lost 100,000 square kilometers of forest. But landscape ecologists came into the picture and made some important points, such as that, well, it's also the pattern of the forest change that is going to be very important ecologically. And therefore, the patterns of fragmentation will be almost as important in the conversation about deforestation as the absolute magnitudes of forests that are lost. And so over time, my colleagues and I have started looking more and more at fragmentation for this very reason. And it's also the case that it's an important consideration in its own right. This also goes back to some of the ecologists who became concerned about ecological change in the basin. The people who looked at fire, for example, well, the roads and the fragmentation patterns become corridors for the spread of fire. And the fire is something that has a much bigger impact than you might expect just examining the path of the fire itself. And what do I mean by that? Well, people such as Lawrence who look at edge effects, and for example, if you go down an area of cleared land, or if you go down a road that's been built into the forest, well, it's not the case that the forest will suddenly be in its full primary state 10 meters from the road. There's an edge effect. If you look at biodiversity, you look at biomass, you look at all these measures of the integrity of the forest, you find that there's a real dramatic impact right close to the areas that are exposed along the fragmentation edges. And it's not until you get several kilometers in that you escape this impact. And this is largely due to the spread of fire that moves down these corridors. So, you know, the fragmentation issue is an issue that also invites a discussion about how fire spreads in the Amazon and the damages it does and the extent to which it's responsible for what are called edge effects. So the one thing we've observed, we took it upon ourselves a couple of years ago to try to account for the various types of fragmentation that are found in the basin. And our thinking was twofold. That one, can you say that particular types of fragmentation are more or less harmful to certain biological indicators than others? Indicators such as biomass or biodiversity or what have you, okay? So that was one of the reasons we began paying attention to this. The other was that we observed that you tended to oftentimes get completely different, fundamentally different social processes that were generative of the types of patterns of fragmentation that you observed. And so we developed a concept called what did we call it? It was process to pattern to process. What do the landscape ecologists say? What is it? Pattern to process, right? Well, we said that, well, you have to understand the social processes first to get to the landscape patterns, which would then have impacts on the ecological processes. And so that was, you know, why we started examining the fragmentation patterns of the basin. And so right back here, I've come to Itaituba. And Itaituba is an interesting case because it turns out that the PIC, the Projeto de Integração e Coordenação, that spread from Altamira along BR 230 came out and essentially stopped right here on Maricitubas here, and it came out to the river and stopped. And there was an expectation that it would pick up on the other side of the river, but it didn't. That's when Amazon National Park was created, in a sense, to bottle up the expansion of the PIC along BR 230. Well, the final historical outcome were fundamentally different patterns of fragmentation. So here to the right along BR 230, you see the famous fishbone pattern of fragmentation and landscape occupation. Whereas out beyond Itaituba, we observe a pattern that we refer to as radial fragmentation. And so our thinking is that, well, the radial pattern will have a different impact on the ecological potential of the region than the fishbone pattern. We can talk about that later. Now, there's another pattern that we identified called rectilinear fragmentation. And this comes from Mato Grosso. Typically, you'll see this in areas of large mechanized farming. And in many places, the pattern of fragmentation doesn't exist anymore anyway, because the entire area has been completely leveled. It's just a mosaic of a few little forest patches left. But when there were still forests, the pattern that you would observe where large holdings came upon the forest or highly capitalized interest, it manifested in what we refer to as a rectilinear pattern of forest fragmentation. This one, Marianne mentioned Terra do Meio, the scenario between the Xingu, the Iriri, and then south of flows south of the 880, and then the 880 curves to the south. So you can see the 880 River, and then it goes all the way practically to the Mato Grosso border. And this has been an area of, Marianne's been very interested in this area for a long time. South Felix do Xingu, I believe, is right over, somewhere right over in here. And, but people crossed the Xingu and entered into Terra do Meio, and it was really a process driven by, well, tin mining, but also a mahogany boom. And it gave rise to a very intricate pattern of forest fragmentation, what we refer to as a dendritic pattern of forest fragmentation. And when we add it all up, what we get is, and this is for the entire basin, if we look at in the way you can actually say something quantitative about this is you can actually measure the lineal extent of the roads and the different fragmentation frontiers, if you will. And so this is what we've done. There's almost 500,000 kilometers of roads in the Amazon basin now. Okay, that's quite a bit. Think about it. Okay, and of that, okay, this is, I mean, relatively. This could be updated a bit. Some people put this number higher. Official roads, those built by the feds and also by the state government. Here it's listed at about 50,000 kilometers. But it's the unofficial roads that built at an order of magnitude, they achieve an order of magnitude greater length than the official roads. And then if we break them down by the different types of frontiers, we can see just how important they are in the basin. Now, let me just make a couple points here. One, the stem of the rose pattern is a fairly unique pattern. They didn't have a good figure of it. But if you go up BR 163, you can look at it and see it on Earth Google. BR 163 is almost straight north and south. Okay, it curves a little bit to the east, but then bends back around, was the Cachimbo, that area, Serra de Cachimbo, but then comes back north to Nova Progresso and goes on up. But if you look out, you look along, you'll see little pricks coming out from either side of it. We call it stem of the rose, and it's associated with gold mining in the region. So when gold mining in the upper Tapajos Basin was very big through the 70s and 80s, the miners built these roads off BR 163 out to the gold was typically off the road a ways. And so this formed what we call the stem of the rose pattern of fragmentation. Now, you can look at this from several perspectives. From the ecological perspective, you could say, well, how much of the forest is impacted by rectilinear as opposed to dendritic fragmentation? And I'm sure landscape ecologists would have some things to say about that. Some of our work shows, for example, that the fishbone pattern of fragmentation is more forgiving on the ecology than, for example, the radial pattern of forest fragmentation. But this is an area of active research of ours. The other thing you could do would be to look at this and you could attribute different social processes to these frontiers, such as the rectilinear fragmentation pattern, probably associated with what some people have referred to as capitalist frontiers. They typically mechanized agriculture. And you can see that that particular social process accounts for a lot of land. The fishbone, some people have referred to as populist frontiers. Okay, these are oftentimes the frontiers that are associated with these gigantic PIC projects of the federal government in the 70s and 80s, and are found out along BR 230 and BR 364 out through Condonia. Dendritic would be a form of capitalist frontier, probably driven by logging. Stem of the rose, well, however you classify garimperos, I don't know. But the radial pattern we're still thinking about. We think this happens to be a place where official colonization has failed, and people then tend to cluster around urban areas. And people have been attracted into the region for some reason, but there's not enough land, there's excess demand for land, and inadequate supply, and so people tend to radiate out around urban areas. So this is really big in some of the smaller towns, such as Itaituba, Apuí, you'll see it, and then it was at Aripuanã, Nova Aripuanã, going up north from Apuí and that parts of Amazonas state. So you'll tend to see that clustered around urban areas. Now, one thing I'd like to mention is, and this is something that I'd have to say that Marianne inspired us to think about, the the role of social conflict in land cover change and resource use more generally. And I don't think you can think about Amazonian land change without also paying some attention to the social issues. One thing is that there can be competition for land, and it turns out that in order to claim land, oftentimes you have to demonstrate productive use, and the way that's done is oftentimes to clear the forest. So you may want to claim 100-hectare property. Well, you may feel you have to clear 10 to 20 hectares in order to establish a property right before INCRA or someone will recognize that you're a legitimate settler on the land. So a demonstration of productive use interacting with land competition can lead to, deforestation frenzies in some respects. People have to feel like they demonstrate productive use, and they come out, and so they'll clear 10 hectares here, and someone across the street feels like they may encroach on them, so they have to clear more land and demonstrate productive use, and this can be a real contagion effect. So there's that, and this interacts with land hunger. People in Brazil that have no opportunities in cities, or feel they have no opportunities in cities, seeking rural livelihoods. Political circumstances as well can intensify all of this. And the way that I think I like to approach it is just by telling a bit of a story about what happened in the south of Pará, or southeastern Pará. And it's amazing. There was a full-blown guerrilla war there in the early 70s, and we didn't really know much about it until somewhat recently. There's been an opening of some of the military archives, but there's still a lot that's unknown about it. But I personally think the reason that BR-230 was built was because they were trying to flush out these people. I don't know how much it had to do with the geopolitics, but it certainly had a lot to do with their fears of this insurgency in the region. But that's another conversation. This is interesting because there's a part of Brazil that are Pará that people have been somewhat concerned about. It's called the Polígono das Castanhais. It was an area where there was tremendous productivity of Brazil nut, and these were almost pure stands of Brazil nut forests. They're probably anthropogenic forests, but they were quite magnificent forests. And it turns out that these became an area of very intense social conflicts for a number of reasons. And here you can barely see it, but I have the boundary of the Polígono das Castanhais. And after the military coup in '64, there was a fairly severe repression, and some of the militants of the PCdoB, which was the Maoist branch of the Communist Party, went out into the Brazil nut forest in order to essentially hide, and they had a Maoist perception or strategy for world revolution. They wanted to build create a people's war from on the basis of a rural insurgency, which would start to the west of the Araguaia River. And that was their strategy. And so they formed their bases. Their bases are right here, which is amazing. If you go out there today, all you'll see are pastures. And it was 1972, and it lasted about 2 years. And the guerrillas were essentially wiped out, and 1 or 2 of them survived. And but it didn't suppress the peasant movement in the region. And so after this ended, you had just a tremendous. It was a very these are very tense times in this part of Brazil, and especially in Pará. These were areas of armed conflict, and these are areas where they subsequently mass murders took place, typically with fazendeiros assassinating poceros on their alleged holdings. And so it was a period of intense conflict, driven by the political circumstances, driven by land hunger, and also just some of the politics of revolution. How is it that you would create a people's war? Where would you go? They went out here because there were no roads here. Well, there turned out to be a road pretty quickly. They infiltrated in the late 60s, the mid to late 60s, and by the time the guerrilla broke out, the Brazilian government was building the Trans-Amazon Highway, and so it was in '72 they came through this region. But if you look at the polygono and you look at the deforestation that occurred just in the polygono and put it against the time period and the amount of forest in the region, okay, these are just large properties which are called castanhais that were in the region, you find that there's a very dramatic drop in the forest cover that tracks a lot of this conflict. So people were occupying land, clearing it to demonstrate productive use, okay? People were using fire as a weapon, sometimes to burn out small holdings. Large holders were preemptively deforesting in order to avoid land occupations. You had all kinds of forest destructive behaviors occurring in this region that can only be explained by appealing to just the social dynamics of the situation. It had very little to do with the road building or the agronomy. It's just the social conflict aspect. And so as you can see, the amount of forest that was cleared, it drops precipitously. It's really too bad. So hope for the future. I think I heard you talking a little bit about how to combat deforestation when I walked in. And I was going to raise some of these issues and put it more in terms of, well, optimism versus pessimism, I guess. And, hope for the future. Well, what would it involve? Well, people in land change science refer to something called forest transition. You may not have heard about this, but if you look at the European countries, you look at North America, Canada, the United States, what you find in some of the Latin American countries now, a period when forests are cleared, but then there's some point of maximum deforestation, and then the forest starts to recover. Okay, so agricultural areas are abandoned with new technologies. There's rural outmigration. People move to cities, because there are jobs in cities. Manufacturing comes into the towns. Governments set aside areas as nature reserves. So this is well documented in a lot of countries. So part of the question is, well, can Amazonia, is it likely to go through a forest transition, point where deforestation essentially sputters out, and then you start to observe perhaps an uptick in the extent of forest as people leave old colonization areas that are no longer productive, they have sandy soils or what have you. Now, another way it's been framed is, and this is more recently, a guy named Borlaug put a hypothesis out that's called the Borlaug hypothesis. And it ties into this, that, well, if agriculture becomes very, very productive, then you don't need as much land as you originally did to produce for consumers. And so, the agricultural areas can contract, which essentially spares land for nature, if you will. So we talk about the future in the Amazon. I guess, part of the question is, well, could you imagine the onset of a forest transition? Or can you imagine that land sparing would become so effective that you wouldn't need to keep expanding the agricultural frontier into the Amazon? Now, I guess there's some causes for hope in this regard. A lot of people have made a lot out of the so-called soybean moratorium. And so the soybean farmers were able to show that they were no longer deforesting primary forest to create soybean fields. And so they were only going to create fields in areas that already had agriculture or pasture prior to what they wanted to do with the land, okay? So, there has been some hope that, well, if not generating a forest transition, at least, we might drive deforestation down to, a negligible amount. Now, there's some problems with that, but we can talk about that later. There's another part of the argument. And this goes to the first diagram I put up, where you can see the deforestation numbers trailing off in the millennial decade. So they're starting to come down. And a lot of people have gotten real excited about that. And they say, oh, well, the battle's over, the battle's been won. So it's going to go to zero deforestation, and maybe we'll recover forest. Okay. Part of the excitement too is about the effectiveness of environmental enforcement. And Eugenia Rima has recently come out with a paper which shows that some of the so-called blacklisted municipios had a lower than expected deforestation rate due to enforcement than would have been expected. And the only way to explain this is by referring to enforcement of environmental law. And so, there is, some evidence that, enforcement could be working, that the moratorium has worked. And so, cause for hope. Maybe it will, we'll get past this, and, the future is bright. Okay, that's the optimistic side, okay? So, cause for concern. Well, the way I like to frame this is in terms of a tipping point. And, there aren't any really good numbers here. I don't know if I believe the ones that I've seen, but Nobre has threw the number out at 40%. Okay, that if 40% of the forest is cleared, then you're going to go to, he calls them bistable states. Now, there's one state which is you maintain the closed moist forest in the Amazonian biome, and then there's the other state, which is basically the Cerrado and the Caatinga come and dominate all of Amazonia. And so if you get to a magnitude of 40% of deforestation, you've had such an impact on rainfall recycling that rainfall drops below 1,000 millimeters per year for the entire basin. And so you get a systemic switch to a shrubby system. And so, if you put the number 17% up against the 40%, then the question is, could it tick all the way up to 40? And if it's 40, should you be satisfied with 40? What about uncertainty? Maybe you should be thinking confidence intervals of 10% around. I don't know, but you're playing with fire. You're at 17 and you're ticking up, which you still are, but it's at a slower rate. And so, and the reason that I'm pessimistic is that this moratorium was just, it's an absurd thing to say that it ended deforestation. It didn't. And it didn't because an indirect land use change. And we have two papers published in the literature, starting with the UREMA piece in 2011, I think, and then more recently, Pete Richards, where we show that it's called the indirect land use effect. And so even though the soybean farmers are doing what they say, well, when they absorb land or cattle pastures, the cattle pastures just don't disappear. They're displaced somewhere else. Well, guess where? They're displaced to the frontier, the forest frontier. And so there's a displacement of land effect. And even though the soybean farmers are not cutting primary forests and occupying old pastures, they're displacing the pastures of Mato Grosso to the forest frontiers of BR 163 or wherever else. And so indirect land use change is really a pretty substantial effect. Now, the other reason that I'm really worried about the future is this IIRSA project. And if you read the documentation on it, it reads like a horror, a script for a horror movie on how to destroy a large, beautiful resource. They want to turn, and this in their language, they want to turn the Amazon into a multimodal hub for connecting Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans for international trade. And in order to do that, okay, they want to put down something like 100,000 kilometers of paved roads, and they want to put down 20,000 kilometers of hidrovia, okay, waterways. And those numbers are really quite large. If you think about it, if you look at the US, we have 40,000 kilometers of waterways. Well, the Amazon, IIRSA wants to put 20,000 kilometers of waterways in the Amazon. Okay, the U.S. has 77,000 kilometers in an interstate system. Okay, well, they want to put 100,000 kilometers of roads in the Amazon basin. And not only that, as part of this, they're building, there's a plan to build a lot of big dams. And if you look at the IIRSA documentation, they have, dams that have been built, dams that are being built, dams that are being planned, dams that we think we might want to build someday. And if you add those all together, it's 600 plus dams that they want to build in the basin. And this is the map from International Waterways showing the different dams that are part of this plan. And it's hard for me to imagine that if you built that many dams, brought that much hydropower, which is a factor of production, into the region, if you built all that, if you improved the transportation system to that extent, that you wouldn't have a very significant impact on the forests in the region. So it's hard for me to imagine that there would be anything but a big impact under this plan. So in terms of the future, I think that deforestation numbers will tick back upwards, particularly with trouble in the Brazilian economy. And this is largely a function of Chinese demand for soybeans, and the Chinese are having problems now, but once China's back up and humming, then those market demands will grow again. So, the battle's not over by any means, and I'm not here to say that it's a hopeless cause by any means, but I think more work needs to be done.